Section 1.2 talks about observational studies versus designed experiments. So first we have to define some terminology. An explanatory variable is one which may be used to explain or predict changes in the values of another variable. It's often called an independent variable or a predictor variable. In other words, this is the variable that if we were doing an experiment we might try to change and then see what the effect is on other variables. So a response variable is one for which the values change in response to changes in another variable. This is often called a dependent variable. An observational study measures the value of the response variable without attempting to influence the value of either the response or the explanatory variables. In other words, in an observational study, the researcher simply observes the behavior of the individuals in the study without trying to influence the outcome of the study. If a researcher assigns the individuals in a study to a certain group, intentionally changes the value of the explanatory variable for the different groups, and then records the value of the response variable for each group, then the researcher is conducting a designed experiment. So the real difference between an observational study and a designed experiment is that in an observational study, researchers are just making observations without trying to influence the outcome. In a designed experiment, the researcher is trying to find out something by actually changing explanatory variable for different groups or different individuals. Here's an example. Some researchers wanted to investigate cancer risk among Danish cellular phone users who were followed for up to 21 years. To do this, they kept track of over 420,000 people whose first cellular telephone subscription was between 1982 and 1995. In 2002, they recorded the number of people out of all of these who had a brain tumor and compared the rate of brain tumors in this group to the rate of brain tumors in the general population. Our first question here is, was this an observational study or an experiment? In other words, did the researchers try to apply a treatment or apply something that would change the explanatory variable? No, they didn't. All they did was make observations. Notice here it says they just kept track of these people who had their first subscription between 1982 and 1995, and then they recorded how many of them had a brain tumor. So all they were doing was observing. That would make this an observational study. The next two questions we want to answer are, what would the explanatory variable and the response variable be? Well, the explanatory variable would be their amount of cell phone use. The response variable would be whether they ended up with a brain tumor or not. Another example along these same lines, this is still talking about cell phone use and brain tumors, but in this case the researchers used rats. So the rats in group 1 were exposed to one level of cell phone, one level of radio frequency radiation. The rats in another group were exposed to a different level of radiation, and the rats in the third group received no radiation at all. The rats in all three groups were treated the same except for the radio frequency. So was this an observational study or an experiment? In this case, we had the three groups, and the explanatory variable was varied according to which group the rat was in. So this would be an experiment. So in both of these studies, the goal was to determine if radio frequencies from cell phones increase the risk of contracting brain tumors. In both of them, whether or not brain cancer was contracted is the response variable, and the level of cell phone usage was the explanatory variable. So often in research, we want to determine how varying the amount of an explanatory variable affects the value of a response variable. Now, a lurking variable is an explanatory variable that was not considered in a study, but that can affect the value of the response variable in the study. Lurking variables are usually related to explanatory variables considered in the study. Here are some more examples. In each of these, we're going to determine whether the study is an observational study or an experiment, and we'll identify the explanatory variable and the response variable. So in this first one, researchers wanted to assess the long-term psychological effects on children evacuated during World War II. They obtained a sample of 169 former evacuees and a control group of 43 people who were children during the war but were not evacuated. The subjects' mental states were evaluated using questionnaires. It was determined that the psychological well-being of the individuals was as adversely affected by evacuation. So, was this an observational study or an experiment? All the researchers did in this case was collect data and make observations. So this would be an observational study. The explanatory variable would be whether the person was evacuated or not. And the response variable would be the psychological well-being. Another example, xylitol has proven effective in preventing dental caries or cavities when included in food or gum. A total of 75 Peruvian children were given milk with and without xylitol and were asked to evaluate the taste of each. Overall, the children preferred the milk flavored with xylitol. This would be a designed experiment because the researchers were actually intentionally changing the values of the explanatory variable instead of just observing. So the children were given a type of treatment. The explanatory variable here would be whether the milk had xylitol or not. And the response variable would be the evaluation of the taste. So whether the child liked the milk with the xylitol or not.